Hi, I'm Andrew Goodson. I'm here with Frank Turnbull, and we are discussing today some of the issues that crop up and both the good points and the bad points regarding running insolvency cases remotely. And I think probably the best first question I would ask to open this, Frank, is do you think overall it's been positive or negative for running the cases at a remote manner during this COVID crisis?
Oh, that's a good question. It's a difficult one to answer because I think it's better in so many ways, but at the same time, as this goes on for longer, you see a loss of particular aspects that make it easier to run. So the best model for me has to be the hybrid, where you're actually in the office for a few days, you can exchange ideas, and then you can go and work remotely. But that's not going to be everyone's experience. And I think that we've now done a year, or 9 months of everyone trying to run cases remotely, and that's thrown up a few interesting points. That's thrown up a few lessons learned, and it's also made it very clear that different people have engaged with this situation very differently. So the ability to run something better remotely is actually a very personal thing to the staff member, and that will then be governed by one, what their role is, their seniority, their work environments, and various other factors that come into play. I suppose as part of the idea of dodging bullets, we're looking at how this then impacts onto the business area. So the most relevant thing is going to be how do you identify, I suppose, the people who can't run cases remotely better, and what are the factors that maybe can be influenced, and how do you make it so that people can run cases well remotely? For me, as a starting point, the the staff are the key. So the staff are the most valuable resource that any firm has. The experience of the staff, their knowledge, their skills, their ability to develop and push forward the cases is really critical. And therefore, in this current environment with everyone working remotely, how do you ensure that everyone can still operate comfortably? Some people may be very happy working in that. Others may miss either the social interaction, general conversations, the sharing of ideas, or simply the ability to do things in a manner which they feel most comfortable doing them. If you take someone who's very used to being able to sort of take down paper notes and assimilate information in a physical format, they may feel very uncomfortable moving from that onto a laptop, or a laptop with multiple screens, and that may then have a knock-on impact. If we don't ask them the question, we don't know whether it's working as well for them. You could suddenly have this loss of efficiency, which could then have a serious impact onto the business. And I suppose following on from that, how people interact at a social level also affects how happy they are or how productive they are at work. So for some people, they may be very happy working in a silo with occasional sort of contact. With others, they may want the constant hustle and bustle of conversation and the sharing of ideas. Now, is it the responsibility of the people at a senior level to tailor an approach to each individual member of staff? That becomes a little bit unworkable. But the idea that there's a sort of a one solution for all, or a one perception for all, doesn't quite work.
I think I'd very much agree with that. I think to answer my own question from the start, I think it's been a mixed bag. I think on balance, probably overall slightly better, but it's going to really depend on the staff, the workforce, and the work that's being done. If you risk making generalizations, one can easier see someone who's perhaps in their 40s, they're married, they own their own property, they've got a large enough house that there's enough room for an office space, that for those sorts of people, working from home is a more comfortable change than if you have a junior administrator who's in their 20s and is still living at home with their parents and is now having to work from their bedroom and sitting on their bed. There was even an article in I think it was on the Guardian where it was guidance on how best to work from your bed. And the point there is, and it reflects on what you're saying, whilst you can't you can't really expect a firm of IPs to completely tailor an approach to every one of their staff. But if you find out the position of all the staff and get an idea of how they really feel about it, and unfortunately, this is the sort of thing where probably a partner-led drive isn't ideal, because people aren't going to feel they can probably speak quite as openly if they're not so happy about the situation with their partners. But if you can find out how they actually feel, then it's far easier to look at what you can do to address it, if even if you can't do it in an ideal manner. And an obvious first bullet to that is, if it's someone who, for whatever reason, isn't particularly happy, and especially if they're not happy with the firm, but not just because of the working environment, if you don't have to leave your home, it's very easy to change employer. If all you're going to do is change the VPN you log on to, then it might be an easier switch. Within, I think, 3 months of the start of the first lockdown, I saw the first advert on LinkedIn that was using as a selling point for someone at senior manager level that it was a work from home post. And so there's that risk, and there will be some fracturing as different firms try out different approaches as to how it goes. And looking after the staff becomes a key thing, and it is more difficult to do over a distance and from remotely.
I mean, there's nothing negative about sort of caring about your staff's interests, and it needs to go beyond the sort of the box checking exercise of health and safety at work, and do you have a comfortable chair that's at the right height, and do you have an environment that allows you to work properly. Everyone's had to improvise to a degree to come up with a work environment that suits them. People are having to share their work environment with partners, perhaps, who are also working. They might have children. There's lots of anecdotal evidence about people having to corral themselves in so that the toddlers can't get at them, or can't sort of destroy things. And people with newborns may frequently find that they have interrupted calls, or they can't find an easy way of dealing with things. But it doesn't mean that working from home or the remote working is less efficient. People can be as efficient, but everyone also just needs to work their time. I find that understanding that the nature of remote working is now flexible working, is de facto flexible working. Everyone is working at the hours that are available, because in the Venn diagram of your work life and your personal life, of course, there's now a massive overlap. And so the best way to get the most effective sort of outcome from your staff, from your team, from your firm, or from your business, is going to be to accept that this is the new reality, and to accommodate it, and to be fairly open about discussing what works, what doesn't work, and how to sort of come up with the best outcome. And if that involves working late into the evenings, or sort of start early mornings, or having large amounts of the day where you're not available for whatever reason, these things are all manageable. We're all sharing various different calendars and common sort of IT facilities that allow us to see when people are or aren't available, and I think that everyone's aware of what they need to do to make sure that their work is done.
Yeah, and I think there's plenty of research across a number of industries that's found that when people work from home, there is an increase in their productivity. Now, doubtless part of that is there's often kind of a guilt or a fear of being viewed as just slacking off when you're working home, particularly from before so many people were doing it. And so there becomes sort of that drive to, I'm going to log on a bit early, make sure I do a bit of work early, and I'm going to make sure that I'm doing work at a later time, so people can see, even if I wasn't available in the middle of the day, they can see I was on from before 8 and I was still on at 6:30. So therefore, there's no doubt that I have done my hours. And that's both a good and a bad thing. It's good for the firm that the productivity's gone up, but you probably don't want your employees to be quite so fearful. Particularly, generally, the fear is driven purely by the employee. It's very seldom that the employer is applying pressure down for them to evidence that they're doing work at these different times. It's just the employee feels that's what they must do, so as to make sure there can be no questions of that happening. But I think to potentially do this topic to death, it is just understanding the employees, the issues they face, and trying to see what you can do to support that. And as you move across into the more sort of business sphere, You then start to have things like, one of the first things is going to be the IT setup and making sure that, as far as possible, the IT system survives. There's nothing more irritating than you've got the time, right, I'm now going to work, and then the IT falls down. That's the same if you're in the office or if you're not. But it's at least if you're in the office, people can see you've made it there. If you've just disappeared off of the network for a while, people might not understand that. And so that's one of the key points there.
I think you've just also touched on a point about sort of equality in a way. We sort of talked about the idea of the work environment, and you might have someone at a very senior level who has the workspace. Ensuring that everyone has an equal and sufficiently highly specified ability to work, so everyone has the same laptop, everyone has the phone, everyone has the right software, everyone is aware that software isn't there to provide the solution to everything. The human skills are still very relevant, but they're not going to be disadvantaged by having different kind of setups. I mean, some of the stories that would come out from either colleagues or contacts on how people were trying to engage with remote working from the very early stages were frankly very surprising, because in a previous job I was working remotely as a consultant, and I was used to remote working 2 or 3 days a week from a laptop or 2 different laptops. So it was a very commonplace thing. And the idea that now people still have issues accessing software, conducting video calls, is surprising. But it's the employers, the employer has the ability to deal with those problems and facilitate their staff engaging with their work as straightforwardly as possible.
Yes, and then moving on to, I think, one of the other parts of the business, which is protecting the firm from the staff doing things incorrectly. And two potential issues flag up to me particularly here is, one is for things like data protection and IT protection policies, it's far easier for a member of staff, whether inadvertently or intentionally, to cause data to leak out of the system. You can far easier control the flow of electronic data when they're in your office, they're on your premises, and you completely control that internet connection. Even with the VPN, it's possible for data to flow out and get outside of the controlled area, and then off it goes. And I think the second issue is, whilst we can all do online training, and that might perhaps form part of an attempt to try and keep some communal working together, you lose what I think is one of the more valuable parts of working in an office, which is the sort of training by osmosis, that merely by being in the same space as other people who've got different levels and different amounts of experience, both more or less, you then sort of start to pool experiences, pool knowledge. And I've been saying before, when you sit next to someone, even if you don't always work with them, you start to learn about their cases because you're there next to them. You discuss them with each other, any possible issues, good points. You can sing about your praises to the people on the bank of desks you work with. And I think losing that is it's a key thing, and I think it's easy to overlook just how much learning happens there.
Yes, I agree. I think that there's a lot of interchange between people, both on skills that they might have, and also it allows a sort of open forum for discussion. Something which came to mind for me on the training point is that we can think about our work from the most complex restructuring right the way down to the smallest, most inconsequential voluntary arrangements. But there's going to be a variety of different things that we're undertaking at that level. And if you were to take someone at the lower end who was simply looking at, how you conduct an efficient income review on an individual, it's useful to be able to exchange the ideas on, what might be relevant nowadays in respect of expenditure. What are the figures that should be considered, which might then determine whether or not sort of either contributions or, say, an IPA should be reviewed. We frequently target the higher value things as being of more interest when talking about casework, but the truth is there is a lot which goes on at lower levels which might have less of a financial impact on the cases we work on, but where those skills are essential, and then sort sort of part and parcel of what people do on a day-to-day basis. And there's a lot of changes that have come about over the last year with furlough and with the ever-changing government guidance, which are relevant to that training. And there's a whole separate discussion about how you keep people up to date and engaged with all those changes, but also keeping people's skills sharp on that work, which might have been routine, but where the sort of the sense of limbo that people felt over the early stages of the lockdown last year in 2020 means that people may have started to lose some of those skills, or started to lose their own confidence in their skills to undertake that work. And once again, I suppose it's another bullet, is looking to people's training and skills and making sure they're comfortable with what they're doing, and make sure they're still openly discussing what they do, without feeling like they're losing that ability. I can see a form of anxiety almost developing, where people suddenly wonder whether they still know how to do their own job, simply because the environment's changed and they're not comfortable with it.
And I think it's something you've said before, Frank. This isn't just going to apply to the IPs with regards to the potential loss of knowledge going forward. Is presumably any professionals as well.
Yes, I think that's right. I think that everyone is in this. We shouldn't presume that just because we're engaging lawyers or counsel to work for us, or we're sort of engaging agents, that they won't also have suffered a sort of a loss of momentum on their work. Also, people who are coming in at a more junior level may not be gaining the same level of learning and development that we might have expected to see in the past. So there may be things which are just lost, and it's. I hate the phrase, we're all in it together. Of course we're all in it together. Everyone knows that. But it's we need to accept that this will have affected everyone else that we work with as well, both peers and also the people, the professionals that we would engage with.
I think that's right. So I think, sort of, to keep this discussion short, because we could be here forever on this. I think for myself, some of the key takeaway points are remembering that everyone's individual. There's going to be members of staff that love it, members of staff that hate it, probably depending on how easy it is to bury themselves in their work and prefer no interruptions. And then, the staff are still the most important part of any practice, particularly for professional services. And then to have a keen eye on how the staff are doing, what they might want to do in the future, just having an open, honest dialogue. And then looking at the business side, it's having probably a frequent review of the IT, because what was working at the start of lockdown might no longer be appropriate now. How you monitor staff. I mean, there's stories of some firms that want sort of teams on 24/7, and they can always see what you're doing. Whether that's going to help staff morale or not, I don't know. There was the stories of Microsoft with their analytics being able to tell you who's having the most chats with other people, who's making the most amendments to group documents, and also being aware that there is a large potential for, not a huge amount, we're not suggesting that lawyers will suddenly forget how to lawyer, but that some of the finer points might be lost, and they might not be able to so easily keep up with the CPD because they're not having the same physical interactions, say with counsel, where counsel might say, I had this interesting case that touched on a similar point recently, where you might not have that same level of engagement. And so it's just, as ever, it's being far more aware that parts of this are very much the same as we were, just in a different location, but there are other things that have changed quite markedly, and those that can best spot the difference between the two, and then it's not always going to be easy, I think, are those that are going to do the best going forwards in this scenario.
Yes, absolutely. I suppose that there's a separate area here which is about how remote working then plays into remote attendance on sites, and there's a large amount of that which is now down to COVID restrictions and who you can or can't engage with, and the health and safety considerations. I suppose in a way, it's not necessarily that different to going to premises or going out onto a site, and just having to think a little bit more about the environment you're going into and what steps you need to take.
Yeah, as someone who's had to, in the middle of, I think, the second lockdown, undertake a provisional liquidation day one raid, broadly it wasn't too bad. I think ultimately it just became, as ever with those sorts of raids and as ever with day one actions, it's the planning that makes it successful. So long as you properly sit down and plan it, then it generally will go as well as it can. None of them go perfectly. We always learn on them, but as you say, it's not hugely different. You just have to take into account a few different points different risk factors that might come up.
Yes, I find it interesting and actually possibly quite useful to do a compare and contrast on how things might have happened beforehand and how they would happen now. So I have an old case where we traded a nursery, or allowed the bankrupt license to trade the nursery, but that required regular site visits. And going to a nursery in the middle of a pandemic is something that is not something I would seek to choose to do. But if that were to be the situation now, how would we choose to do it? Would we still actually elect to be involved in the trading of a nursery, given all the additional risk factors that are there? That's a good starting point. But I think everyone can look to what they've done beforehand to see where the subtle differences are and what you do, how you engage with people, what precautions need to be taken. And I think worth remembering that there's been a reaction to the last year, which has been to accept that people have used lockdown as a reason to not engage with us as a profession because they're sort of involved in cases, or not communicate in the same kind of way. And I don't think that should be accepted. I think we need to accept people should carry on engaging just with whatever means are possible. If you can't have a face-to-face meeting, you can always speak by telephone, you can have a video call. Sending letters out may be complicated if you don't have a facility there for remote sort of letter issuing, but email is perfectly viable. There is no reason not to carry on correspondence to exactly the same level as before, if not more, given the ability to people to work remotely. We just need to make sure we step away from any remaining conventions which tie us to what would have been our sort of former office processes. And that just needs to be embraced, I think.
No, I'd very much agree. I think that's a fine message on which to close the chat and thank anyone for watching. And no doubt this will rumble.